Now, with the end of Chapter 7, we see that the Constitution is fully ratified, and the Constitution itself initially did not enjoy, the full support of Americans. Many folks, particularly the Anti-Federalists, believe that it took away a lot of power from the individual states and gave it to this central authority. And they wanted to ensure that the individuals in every state, regardless of the size or the industry of that state, were protected from a powerful central government. And they insisted on this Bill of Rights. And fortunately for us, the Federalists really wanted the Constitution to be widely supported. And so they drafted up this Bill of Rights, which was ultimately added to the Constitution. And today, when we think about the Constitution, we tend to think about the Bill of Rights first. We think about things such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, the Second Amendment, the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination, and others. And those were added truly as a way to ensure that the Constitution had popular support. Now, as we move into Chapter 8, this early republic, these new frontiers of this early republic, what we will see is the importance of establishing a new national identity in what is now the United States. Now, education was immediately tied to the needs of the new nation. Noah Webster's American Spelling Book and American Dictionary of the English Language were used nationally, and both helped to standardize American English, which it was very important that American English be separate and distinct from British English. One of the most common practices initially was altering the spelling of words. So we see that with the word color. In British, it would be, in British English, it would be spelled C-O-L-O-U-R, but that U was dropped to give this a kind of distinctly American writing and model. And this is very important because this is about creating a separate identity from the British. The number of schools increased after the Revolution, and plans for free public education spread. Now, it will take some time before free public education is truly realized, but there was a sense that there needed to be a certain level of education that all Americans would earn. And it needed to be distinctly American, separate from Britain, but it needed to be in place so that Americans could be successful and continue to be independent. Now, there were existing colleges already in America, but they became viewed with great suspicion because of their English roots and the potential for the corruption of the students in those urban areas where vice was more plentiful. This resulted in a push for the creation of new colleges based on revolutionary ideals. Now, vice is a big word, and you'll see that a lot through the remainder of the term. And vice sort of refers to anything that might be considered amoral at the time. So gambling, prostitution, drinking, smoking, even younger kids in college who might be dating privately out of the view of their parents or out of the view of a responsible adult. Any of those things might be considered vice. Frontier schools and colleges were established to educate the nation's youth. These schools emphasized their isolation away from the big cities as a way to ensure to parents that education was the main focus, unlike those English heritage schools that were in more urban areas. So we see a lot of schools that spring up along the frontier areas. The wives and families of the faculty and administrators played important roles in these schools, creating communal and familial atmospheres for the students. Now, it is important to note that the schools are run primarily by men. So there are no female teachers, there are no female administrators. There are some female employees who work in kitchens and in kind of housekeeping and things of that nature. Now, cultural groups like the Hartford Wits from Yale contributed to the growing national culture by creating works that expressed distinctly American perspectives. Advances in technology increased the circulation of novels, which in turn helped shape women's roles and expectations regarding marriage, as women began to read more novels. The early 19th century saw the emergence of significant literary figures like Washington Irving, whose short stories and essays took both light-hearted and a more somber aim at the traditional views and romanticized visions of American history. Books celebrating the nation's past and its culture were widely popular in the 19th century. The nation's history and its emphasis on liberty were reflected in the artistic works as well. Nature engravings became popular, blending art with education. Groups like the Philadelphia American Philosophical Society, which was co-founded by Benjamin Franklin, promoted American literature and science. American artists and scientists benefited from European knowledge, but also took pride in their own American identities. To help forge a national identity, white Americans employed a variety of American Indian-inspired themes and names, as well as other symbols from Native American culture. Poets and writers, especially in New England, emphasized the noble nature of Indians in their works, promoting a romanticized view of the lost cultures. American Indians were viewed less favorably in the frontier regions where they continued to fight for their lands and their rights. Artists and other authors frequently portrayed both Indians and African Americans in very demeaning ways. The lack of access that Indians and African Americans had to formal education or established publishers meant that written portrayals of minority groups, whether romanticized or demonized, were typically completed by white Americans and reflected their views on these groups rather than the actual true experiences of the minority groups. White Americans' concern for the improvement of education did not extend to Indians or African Americans. Free blacks established their own schools and formed literary societies, but white Americans, for the most part, denied education to non-white Americans. White leaders believed that education should play a different but still limited role for American Indians. Small numbers of Indians were educated by missionaries or in Eastern schools, but their education focused not on Indian languages or histories, but on non-native subjects. The differing educational goals and strategies that white Americans adopted for Indians and African Americans reflect different views of each group. Indians were seen as uncivilized but having potential, whereas African Americans were viewed as inherently inferior and thus unworthy of any effort to educate them. Some African Americans and many white Americans questioned blacks' future in a nation like the United States, even outside of slavery, and this resulted in proposals for a settlement in Africa. The ideas of settlement in Africa, or immigration with an E as blacks saw it, colonization as whites saw it, became the focus of the American Colonization Society and others seeking to end slavery or to solve race problems. Many Northern free blacks opposed immigration, however, because they viewed it as distinctly prejudiced in nature. The expansion of and the dependency on slavery in the South made settlement in Africa an impractical solution. The construction of the nation's new capital highlighted the role of slave labor, as its location was surrounded by slave owners. Slaves helped to clear the land, build the roads, and construct buildings, and a limited number provided skilled or domestic labor. Free blacks such as Benjamin Banneker also participated in building the Capitol. A diverse group of workers, including American and immigrant laborers and foreign architects and engineers, helped to build Washington City, underlining the, quote, American, end quote, nature of the Capitol. The geography and climate of the city contributed to some of the negative impressions of this Republican capital. The capital was at the center of the nation's political world, but the social aspects of the city helped to define it as well. Politicians and their wives helped to create an identity for Washington City. The disparate worlds of the capital, such as the powerful and the slaves and other laborers, highlight the discrepancies in American life and thought in the earliest years of the American Republic. After Jefferson took office in 1801, the Democratic Republicans quickly put into operation their vision for the nation, which included limiting the power of the federal government, shrinking the national debt by reducing the government's expenditures, ending Federalist legislation, and limiting the power of the Bank of the United States. Foreign events forced President Jefferson to draw on his own presidential powers. His refusal to pay tribute to the Barbary states of North Africa resulted in attacks on American ships. Jefferson sent the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps to retaliate, and ultimately the United States negotiated a lower tribute payment. In 1803, the Haitian Revolution succeeded in establishing the first independent Black-led nation in the Americas. But the prolonged conflict that had begun in 1791 resulted in thousands of Haitian refugees fleeing to the United States. The Haitian Revolution alarmed many Southern whites who feared that it would inspire a slave rebellion in the United States. Such plans were uncovered in Virginia, heightening the fears of slave owners. Following the French defeat in Haiti, Jefferson sent James Monroe to France to secure the navigation rights of the Mississippi River. Napoleon instead offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. While the land purchase fell outside of the strict interpretation of the Constitution, Jefferson ultimately agreed to it, pleasing the politicians and ordinary Americans, most of whom did not care that this purchase expanded the presidential and congressional powers. Here you can see the Louisiana Purchase, which is this orange area. So effectively, this purchase that Jefferson makes, this sweetheart of a deal, if you will, really doubles the size of the United States at the time. Congress sent an expedition called the Corps of Discovery to map the new territory. Captain Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led this expedition. The Corps was assisted in its efforts by numerous Indians, including Sacagawea, who traveled with the expedition. Also, among the members of the expedition was an African-American slave named York. Lieutenant Zebulon Pike explored the southern portion of the Louisiana Territory starting in 1806. Mexican forces captured and later released his men, but not before Pike explored much of the area that would become the United States in later decades. Jefferson won re-election in 1804, but his goal of reining in federal powers had not been achieved at this particular point. Now, here we can see the territories that Pike really begins to explore that will later on become part of the United States. Here is the original part of that Louisiana territory. There are still some parts of what is now the United States that have influence from other groups. This territory up here is still claimed by Britain and Spain as well as the United States. It's a little bit undecided at this point. We also have the Spanish Florida area here, which will be decided in the coming decades. Before the Federalists were voted out of power in 1800, they established their dominance in the judicial branch by passing the Judiciary Act, which created new courts and judgeships which were filled by Federalists. They also appointed the Supreme Court's new Chief Justice, John Marshall. Marshall's ruling in Marbury versus Madison of 1803 established the principle of judicial review. The Supreme Court had the power and the authority to decide on the constitutionality of federal laws. The following year, the court ruled that it had the power of judicial review over state laws as well. Now, this Marbury versus Madison case is really an interesting case because ultimately there wasn't any body that could decide if a law was legal. And so with Marbury versus Madison, the Supreme Court said, oh, hey, that's us. We get to decide if a law is in line with the Constitution. And then they went further the next year and decided that if a state had a law that may or may not be in line with the Constitution, ultimately that would be decided by the Supreme Court as well. The Supreme Court upheld the Federalist principles in other cases like the McCulloch v. Maryland case of 1819, which reinforced the Federalist ideas of a loose interpretation of the Constitution through the implied powers clause, or the necessary and proper clause. Marshall's leadership of the Supreme Court established the judicial branch as equal in importance to the Congress and the President in terms of framing and preserving the national agenda. Conflict between France and England continues to threaten U.S. security during Jefferson's administration. In an effort to end U.S. trade with France, British naval ships stopped U.S. ships and forced into service more than 8,000 sailors. Now, again, these are British ships who stop American ships and then force the Americans to either become sailors in the British military or be arrested. Congress passed the Embargo Act of 1807 in an effort to economically pressure Great Britain to end its restrictions on U.S. trade. Now, this particular act keeps the United States out of war, but it impacted the commerce in the United States very negatively. Merchants, farmers, and planters all protested the embargo as it resulted in an economic recession and expanded federal power regarding trade. Jefferson's actions as president, especially his advocacy of the Embargo Act, increased the power of the federal government overall, and many small farmers were angered that the man who had formerly championed their rights would enact measures that were so devastating to them. Remember, Jefferson was an anti-federalist. Jefferson believed in this agrarian model where everyone would have a farm and be self-sufficient. But Thomas Jefferson, the anti-federalist, the early framer, is a very different person from President Jefferson, who now has a lot of new responsibilities and new decisions, and also some important powers that are preserved to him by the previous president, John Adams, who was a Federalist. Even with these critiques, most Americans remained pleased with Jefferson's administration. Population increases in the United States spurred the growth of the federal powers and heightened the conflicts with the Indians over slavery. But they also fueled improvements in communication, manufacturing, agriculture, and transportation. White Western migration pushed Indian tribes off of their lands and further west. The population of towns and cities increased both in the east and further into the Western Territory. The government offered favorable terms for buying Western land, and this convinced the yeoman farmers and others to move west, even if doing so brought them into conflict with the other groups that were already living there. Growing populations in the West increased the need for transportation systems such as roads and turnpikes to ship goods and crops. Interstate trade demanded federal funding of internal improvements to transportation, such as the National Railroad. The need for improved efficiency in water transportation resulted in the construction of canals to connect the river systems and the building of steamboats for sending goods up the river. In 1804, Oliver Evans invented a high-pressure steam engine attached to a dredge to clean around the docks, but he lacked the funds to apply this invention to the steam-powered boat. Robert Fulton who received funding from Ambassador Robert Livingston, improved on Evans' invention and in 1807 launched the first steamboat, kicking off the steamboat era in the West. Now, Robert Livingston, who is now an ambassador, hopefully sounds familiar to you. You probably remember him as one of the 5 men who were responsible for drafting that first document. If you recall, I mentioned that when the Declaration of Independence was first becoming a discussion, the Committee of 5 was appointed, and that Committee of 5 included a man named Robert Livingston and another man named Roger Sherman, who I said you might not be as familiar with. It's important to remember that many of these men who were present at the founding and a part of drafting these documents do continue to play important roles in this formation of this new world or this new government. Robert Fulton's steamboat really transforms this particular time. The multiplier effect, in which one invention prompts others, was most visible in the cotton gin and the spinning wheel, inventions that transformed Southern agriculture and Northern industry. Samuel Slater, an English mill supervisor, brought with him to the United States his plans for a replica of Richard Arkwright's yarn spinning machine. With funding from Rhode Island investors, Slater built a spinning mill. Slater's mill, which opened in 1790, spawned other factories and mills in New England, providing work for women and children and increasing the demand for cotton. The demand for cotton spurred another invention to help make cotton profitable in regions where there was only short staple cotton, which required hours of intensive labor to separate the seeds from the cotton fiber. In 1793, Eli Whitney built the cotton gin to solve this problem. His machine could accomplish more in 1 hour than several workers could accomplish in an entire day. Now, in the midst of a quasi-war with France, the government contracted with Whitney to produce 4,000 rifles. To meet this demand, Whitney proposed that machines produce various parts of the rifle, which could then be assembled quickly. Whitney's mass production model became known as the American System of Manufacturing, which allowed less skilled workers to produce goods without needing any lengthy apprenticeship or training. Now, this American System of Manufacturing proposes that pieces of a finished product be assembled by machine or by one person rather than one person assembling all parts of a working product. The inventions of people like Slater and Whitney laid the groundwork for future inventions that altered the lives of generations of factory workers and slaves whose labor contributed to the final products. Now, here we can see the push into the Western Territory and into what was the Louisiana Territory. Here we can see the territory before 1780, and Americans are inching more and more into these different territories in what is known as the West. But we can see that there are natives everywhere. Here we have the Creek, the Cherokee, the Erie, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, the Fox, the Sauk, the Dakota Sioux, the Iowa, the Chippewa, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and so on. We have so many different native groups that are already living in this territory when these migrants from the eastern part of the country begin to encroach upon this territory. Whitney and Slater were only two among a multitude of inventors whose creations were viewed as the hallmark of American ingenuity between 1790 and 1820. Improvements on existing inventions led to other inventions, such as Francis Cabot's power loom for weaving. The evolutionary nature of these inventions allowed for gradual improvement. This comforted many Americans who saw either small mills or household enterprises as ideal. The Embargo Act created a greater need for domestic production, and both factories and household producers met this need. Husbands and wives working together to create a final product took different roles in these domestic enterprises. The patterns of companionate marriage that emerged, especially among the younger couples, were aided by the older visions of mutuality, in which domestic production also relied on the work of children, neighbors, and servants. Now, this companionate marriage would allow for husbands and wives and ultimately their children and neighbors to all work together to produce products that could be sold. Servants and slaves alike saw their roles within domestic labor grow, and mistresses in both northern and southern households expanded their roles as the domestic manager, or the caretaker of the home, who was responsible for ensuring that slaves, servants, and children completed their tasks. At the turn of the century, the majority of Americans still lived on small farms and traded locally to obtain any goods that they could not produce themselves. But by 1820, the new inventions and the expansion of the market economy had transformed their lives.